On October 6, 1973, as Israelis observe the holy day of Yom Kippur, they are stunned by news of a massive surprise assault from both the Sinai and Golan Heights. Egypt and Syria, still haunted by their humiliating loss to Israel in 1967, break through Israeli defenses. For a moment, it even seems possible that the survival of Israel itself could be in danger. As Israeli tanks scramble to mount improvised defenses and reservists rush to the front, the nation's leaders struggle to understand how they had been so completely caught off guard. Since the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel has maintained new, expanded borders along the Suez Canal in the Sinai and the vital Golan Heights bordering Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. After that war, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan refused to recognize Israel or engage diplomatically, while Palestinian militants launch raids on Israeli targets from neighboring Arab lands. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser offers his resignation after the 1967 disaster, but the Egyptian people demand he stay. Nasser realizes Egypt cannot directly defeat Israel, but believes that limited military pressure can both challenge Israeli control of Sinai and keep the struggle alive. In 1969, he explains, "The first priority, the absolute priority in this battle is the military front, for we must realize that the enemy will not withdraw unless we force him to withdraw through fighting. Indeed, there can be no hope of any political solution unless the enemy realizes that we are capable of forcing him to withdraw through fighting." Khalidi 77. The result, from 1967 to 1970, is the so-called War of Attrition between Israel and its Arab adversaries. Israeli and Egyptian forces trade air, naval, and commando raids across the Suez Canal zone. The fighting remains relatively low intensity, with each side claiming retaliation for violations of the 1967 ceasefire. For many Israeli civilians, most of whom are reservists familiar with combat, war becomes a part of life itself. Dr. Itzhak Brook, a pediatrician and reservist, recalls, "I had learned to differentiate between bombing missions and routine flights by the sound of the jet engines. When they carried heavy bombs, the planes were very loud. I could also tell by the sound of the engine the direction to which they were flying." In a society living in constant conflict with neighboring nations and always at the edge of imminent war, this information was crucial. Brook 8. The war of attrition pushes both sides to heavily fortify their key positions. Israel builds the Bar Lev line along the east bank of the canal, massive sand embankments, fortified outposts, anti-tank ditches, and hidden firing ramps for long-range gunnery. Behind these defenses lies a varied arsenal of mostly American and British weapons, plus captured Soviet arms. Many outdated systems are modernized, but the diversity of equipment complicates logistics. Outnumbered by its potential enemies, Israel relies on rapid mobilization and air supremacy to hold out until invaders are crushed. Yet mobilization paralyzes the economy and must be reserved for true emergencies, making accurate intelligence absolutely essential. Some Israeli commanders, including General Ariel Sharon, criticize the Bar Lev line, warning it locks Israel into a passive defense and is too fragile to resist a full-scale Egyptian assault with artillery support. Defenders of the system argue that any such attack would be detected early by Israeli intelligence, allowing preemptive airstrikes to neutralize it. In September 1970, Nasser dies and his longtime ally Anwar Sadat becomes president. He shares the goal of erasing the shame of 1967 and reclaiming Egyptian territory, an ambition mirrored by Syria's new leader, Hafez al-Assad. Both Sadat and Assad aim to launch a joint offensive on Israel, though Jordan and other Arab states abstain. Their plans are strengthened by experience from the war of attrition, knowledge of Israeli tactics, and large new deliveries of Soviet weaponry. During that conflict, Egypt and Syria received vast stocks of Soviet arms, including modern surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, rocket artillery, and advanced anti-tank weapons like the wire-guided Malyutka or Sagar. Modern T-55 and T-62 tanks with night vision sights replaced outdated T-34s, while MiG-21 supplanted older MiG-17s and 19s. Both armies, especially Egypt's, reformed their officer corps, replacing political figures with veterans of the recent fighting. Basic troop training improved as well. Still, Egyptian Chief of Staff Saad el-Shazli recognized his forces could not conquer all of Sinai. Egypt's main weakness lay in its air force. Despite new Soviet aircraft, Israeli pilots were more skilled and better equipped. Both sides also knew that any new war would quickly attract pressure for a ceasefire from the United States and the Soviet Union, whose relations were stabilizing. Thus, Egypt's strategy was to advance swiftly, dig in, repel Israeli counterattacks, and negotiate from a position of strength. This strategy depended on the protective power of its stationary SAM network. In the later stages of the War of Attrition, our SAM emplacements had proven their effectiveness. Israeli pilots had been at pains to avoid them. Where they had passed within range, our SAMs had destroyed them. I was convinced that even to repel our assault, the enemy pilots would still be cautious in braving the SAMs, and that when they did, we could exact a price. The point we could not forget was that our SAMs were static. Shazli. Syria planned a similar approach in the Golan Heights. Though its rugged terrain and deep anti-tank trenches forced armored units to converge at a few narrow crossing points. Israel observed the Arab buildup, but dismissed it as defensive posturing amid constant regional tension. Prime Minister Golda Meir rejected any talk of territorial concessions, insisting Israel held a decisive military edge. Sadat later remarked on Israeli overconfidence. The Israelis thought we would never fight, and they thought they could never be surprised. Balance 10. In 1973, Egypt and Syria chose the most sacred day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, October 6th, for their coordinated attack. Beyond timing, cooperation between the two was limited, but their secrecy was absolute. So when the offensive began, many Israeli officers still doubted it was real. At 2 p.m., 240 Egyptian aircraft struck Israeli bases and command posts across the Sinai. At the same time, 4,000 commandos crossed the Suez Canal under cover of an immense artillery barrage. Using 70 high-pressure water cannons, Egyptian engineers blasted openings through the sand ramparts as waves of troops and vehicles surged through to encircle Israeli strongpoints. Amphibious units crossed Bitter Lake, and within 2 hours, 23,000 Egyptian soldiers were over the canal. Israeli air and tank counterattacks collapsed as Egyptian SAMs and anti-tank teams destroyed them. Chaos engulfed the Israeli Air Force, as planes hastily rearmed for shifting missions between airfields, ground strikes, and dogfights. By 10:30 p.m., Israel had lost 27 aircraft, while Egyptian losses were only about 200 men. By nightfall, 100,000 Egyptian troops had crossed, and the Bar-Lev line lay in ruins. Only one strong point, Fort Budapest, continues to hold out. Its commander describes the methodical Egyptian assault. The Egyptians intensified the confusion by launching smoke shells and followed the Russian doctrine to the letter. Tank after tank, armored personnel carrier after armored personnel carrier, the Egyptian strike force poured off the ramparts and joined the forward elements, with infantry commandos positioning themselves behind each vehicle. Slowly and with precision, the formations aligned themselves into a phalanx and waited for the order to advance. As Egypt attacks across the Suez, Syria strikes simultaneously on the Golan Heights. At 2 p.m., 3 infantry divisions, supported by 2 armored divisions, surge toward the Purple Line. They struggle to bring up bulldozers and bridging equipment, but Israeli long-range tank fire tears into them. A Syrian tanker recalls the ordeal of laying bridges under constant attack. It was difficult to position the bridges and required great skill, because they had to be placed diagonally due to a sand embankment on the far side. We began firing as soon as we crossed the bridges and entered enemy territory. Asher 102. Meanwhile, Syrian helicopter-borne commandos stormed the Israeli observation post on Mount Hermon, overwhelming the 55-man garrison. Yet Syrian losses are severe as vehicles pile into traffic jams, making easy targets for Israeli gunners who concentrate on the bridging tanks. When masses of tanks like these approach, you're bound to hit whichever one you shoot at. You have only seconds to decide which tank is the most critical target. It was clear we had to eliminate all the bridging tanks first. Asher. Still, the Syrians succeed in crossing the anti-tank ditch and engage hastily assembled Israeli defenders. By the end of October 6th, most Israeli units are forced to withdraw. In the Sinai, Israeli forces lose two-thirds of their front-line strength along the Bar-Lev line, around 287 killed or captured, and nearly half their tanks. The Sagar anti-tank missile, largely unknown to Israeli crews, proves devastating. Dr. Itzhak Brook, now serving as a field doctor, inspects a destroyed M60 Patton tank. Though the hull was slightly tilted to one side, the tank appeared intact. The small hole where the missile must have pierced the armor was the only mark showing it had been hit. When I climbed onto the turret and looked inside, I saw everything inside completely wrecked. The stench of the burnt interior was overpowering, and I could smell scorched flesh mingled with the odor of burnt fuel. I could only imagine what had happened to the crew and hoped that at least some had survived. Brook 57. The Israeli leadership initially fears the assault is a full-scale attempt to annihilate the nation. According to some accounts, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan even suggests demonstrating nuclear capability, but Prime Minister Golda Meir firmly rejects the idea. By nightfall, Israel mobilizes 200,000 reservists, though they need time to be armed and deployed. One soldier reflects, "Only yesterday there were high-rise buildings, green lawns, synagogues, and children. Now there are armored columns, desert, khaki, and an endless road leading to war." Rabinovich 155, Block 4. Arab advance Israel prioritizes the Syrian front, as its forces threaten the nation's northern heartland. Nevertheless, Israeli commanders adhere to their doctrine of defense through attack on both fronts, suffering heavy tank losses in the process. Syria's broad front offensive keeps Israeli defenders engaged along the entire line, making counterattack nearly impossible. By October 8th, Syrian reserves enter the battle and press toward the Jordan River, forcing Israeli armor to fall back under immense strain. The 7th Armored Brigade, with just 100 Israeli tanks, holds against 500 Syrian tanks for 4 days in what becomes known as the Valley of Tears. Israeli long-range gunnery exacts a heavy toll by day, but at night, Syrian forces with night vision equipment gain the upper hand. Israeli tanks, lacking such gear, must rely on moonlight and the glow of burning wrecks to see their targets. Reinforcements arrive in fragments, but the 7th Brigade continues to hold. Even so, the Syrian 5th Division begins to break through in the south, advancing toward the Sea of Galilee. Success seems to favor the Syrians as Israeli units, often down to their last tanks, fall back. Israeli ground attack jets attempt to strike Syrian spearheads, but many are shot down. It appears the Syrians are on the brink of a decisive penetration into Israel, and once more, Israeli officials allegedly discuss the unthinkable option of nuclear use. Yet despite battered morale, Israel's position slowly begins to recover. By October 9th, increasing numbers of reservists are hurried to the front in improvised fashion. Syrian forces in the south pause partially to reorganize, which relieves pressure on Israeli defenders. Israeli aircraft strike Syrian supply lines where they lie outside the SAM umbrella, depriving frontline units of desperately needed ammunition. Meanwhile, the 7th Armored Brigade continues to hold the Valley of Tears. Its defense soaks up Syrian reinforcements that would otherwise be used in the south. With the front lines stabilizing, Israel switches to the offensive and mounts an armored thrust toward Quneitra on October 10th. Although such charges proved disastrous against Egypt's prepared defenses, they punch through the less coordinated Syrian formations. At the same time, Israeli operations in the Sinai largely cease. The Egyptians have also halted, and Chief of Staff Saad el-Shazli remarks that Egypt will not bite off more than it can chew, Obalance 74. The Israeli government finally accepts that this is not a blind bid to annihilate the state. To sustain the fight, Prime Minister Golda Meir turns urgently to the United States for resupply, a move that splits opinion in Washington. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger supports immediate aid, but many in the Pentagon and Secretary of Defense James R. Schlesinger argue against large shipments, warning that excessive resupply could needlessly antagonize the Soviets and exceed Israel's operational requirements. President Richard Nixon, wary at first of overtly backing Israel, approves a major military airlift as Soviet support for Egypt and Syria continues. American cargo planes start arriving just as Israel launches its counteroffensive. The initial Israeli assaults on Tel Shams on October 12-13 suffer heavy casualties, but by nightfall, forces are breaking through. The prospect of an Israeli advance on Damascus inflames anti-Israeli sentiment across the Arab world, and contingents from Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia move to bolster Syria. Israeli morale, conversely, is buoyed. Privately, King Hussein warns he must commit troops for domestic and regional reasons. As Syria shifts to defend Damascus, Israeli jets skirt the SAM umbrella through Lebanese airspace to strike at Syrian infrastructure in Damascus and Homs, aiming to force a Syrian collapse. Chief of Staff David Elazar explains bluntly, "To destroy them, I need something effective and dramatic that will make the Syrians cry Gewalt and stop shooting. To hit their power stations, everything." Rabinovich 289. As Israeli columns push beyond the 1967 ceasefire line into Syrian territory, Egyptian commanders debate whether to launch an operation to relieve their embattled ally. Chief of Staff Shazli warns that despite Arab gains, Israeli air power and remaining armored formations could still inflict crippling losses outside the SAM shield. "Advance and we destroy our troops without offering any significant relief to our brothers the Syrians." Shazli 246. Sadat, however, overrules Shazli and orders an Egyptian offensive to assist Syria. An Egyptian offensive begins toward the Mitla and Gidi passes. On October 14th, Egyptian formations leave their fortified positions under cover of air strikes and heavy artillery fire. The Israelis, anticipating the move, allow them to advance beyond the protective range of their SAM systems before engaging. What follows is perhaps the largest tank battle since World War II, as Egyptian armor and anti-tank infantry collide head-on with Israeli tank brigades. This time, Israel enjoys both air superiority and the advantage of newly delivered American wire-guided anti-tank missiles, which devastate Egyptian armor. The Egyptian assault quickly loses momentum, and although Israeli forces push forward, they cannot break through to the Suez Canal. The Egyptian army remains numerically superior. Yet within the Egyptian lines lies a critical vulnerability. Israeli commanders, including General Ariel Sharon, identify a gap in the enemy's defenses near Bitter Lake. If the Israelis can cross the canal there, they could potentially strike for Cairo and end the war altogether. On October 15th, Israeli artillery opens a massive barrage along the entire front, masking the true axis of attack through an area known as the Chinese Farm, a complex of irrigation fields and embankments. The site is heavily defended, and brutal close-quarter fighting erupts as Egyptian Sagar missile teams inflict serious damage on advancing Israeli tanks. The struggle continues for days, but small Israeli assault groups eventually punch through toward Bitter Lake, where they make a daring canal crossing with paratrooper assistance. On the western bank, they encounter almost no opposition. Sharon seizes the moment, ordering an immediate thrust rather than waiting to consolidate a bridgehead. Israeli armored columns surge into the Egyptian rear, spreading confusion and striking at SAM batteries and supply depots. Because the crossing lacks a firmly established base, Egyptian High Command assumes it to be merely a limited raid meant for propaganda purposes, and fails to recognize the scale of the Israeli breakthrough. The Battle of the Chinese Farm becomes the turning point. While Sharon's forces execute a daring 100-kilometer sweep deep behind Egyptian lines, other Israeli units begin crossing the Suez Canal in strength on October 18th. Only when Soviet intelligence reports massive Israeli movements does President Sadat grasp the true scale of the operation. By then, the moment to crush the fragile Israeli bridgehead has already slipped away. Tensions erupt within the Egyptian command. Furious at the collapse, Sadat dismisses Chief of Staff Shazli and replaces him with Lieutenant General Abdel Ghani Gamisi, who immediately orders counterattacks on the east bank to sever the Israeli crossing. But Israeli ambushes shred the advancing Egyptian forces before they can make contact. One Egyptian soldier, trapped in the chaos, writes in his diary, "Every time a shell explodes, I want to explode with it. God preserve us. War is the dirtiest word I know." As Israeli troops close in from both sides of the canal, Egypt's Third Army faces the grim prospect of encirclement. Realizing the danger, Sadat accepts a ceasefire on October 22nd. In Damascus, Assad wants to fight on, but without Egypt's participation, Syria has no realistic chance, and he reluctantly agrees. Israel, however, sees an opportunity to strengthen its position before the guns fall silent. The United States and the Soviet Union pressure Prime Minister Golda Meir to halt operations, but many Israeli soldiers believe the ceasefire comes too soon. Israeli soldier, original audio. No, I don't agree because the Egyptians think they succeeded in this war. They think if they've managed to place a few hundred soldiers and tanks on our side of the canal, that's a victory. When the Arabs think they've won, it only encourages them. In a year or two, we'll have another war, and more casualties. That same day, Israel ignores the ceasefire to gain ground. Their forces strike south to encircle the Egyptian Third Army, but fail to break through at Ismailia. The renewed offensive alarms both Washington and Moscow, while Egypt's military situation deteriorates beyond recovery. Only on October 25th does Israel finally observe the ceasefire, officially ending the Yom Kippur War. When the dust settles, Israel holds 1,600 square kilometers on the Suez Canal's west bank and another 500 in Syria's Bashan region. Egypt retains about 1,200 square kilometers of the Sinai Peninsula. After a catastrophic beginning, Israel has turned the tide and driven its enemies back. But one question remains. How did Egypt and Syria manage to take Israel, renowned for its intelligence prowess, so completely by surprise? The answer lies in what Israeli analysts called the concept. This doctrine assumed Egypt would never attack because it was too weak militarily, and that Syria would not fight without Egyptian support. The second assumption proved correct, but the first was a fatal illusion. The concept blinded Israel's intelligence community, creating a mindset where only information confirming their beliefs was accepted, and anything contradicting them was dismissed. Evidence of an impending attack existed. Jordan's King Hussein secretly warned Israel in hopes of keeping his kingdom out of another regional war. Ashraf Marwan, a high-level Egyptian insider and the president's own son-in-law, secretly working as an Israeli spy, also passed on warnings. Yet none of it changed Israeli thinking. Meanwhile, Sadat and Assad carefully concealed their intentions. Sadat, fully aware of Israel's overconfidence, deliberately fed that perception through public statements of moderation and calculated leaks, suggesting diplomatic restraint. Egypt and Syria cleverly spread false reports about their supposed military weakness. Meanwhile, a string of international crises helped disguise their true preparations. The 1972 massacre of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics by Palestinian terrorists, and the February 1973 incident when Israeli jets shot down a Libyan civilian airliner over Sinai, both enabled Cairo and Damascus to justify their rearmament as defensive. Another hostage standoff and an aerial clash over Damascus in September 1973 further distracted Israeli intelligence just as the two Arab states finalized their plans. Having seen similar flare-ups before, Israel's intelligence service did not raise the alarm. Only on October 5th did Israeli officials begin to worry seriously, but political hesitation prevented full mobilization. The Yom Kippur War, known in the Arab world as the October War, lasted 19 days. Casualties vary depending on the source. Israel lost up to 2,800 soldiers, Egypt as many as 15,000, and Syria around 3,500. Several nations joined the Arab coalition, including Iraq, Libya, Morocco, Cuba, and even North Korea. Iraq suffered the heaviest losses among them, with 278 killed. For Israel, the war left a complex legacy. The early days were filled with fear that the country might be overrun, but the swift turnaround restored pride in Israel's military resilience. Still, Egypt retained control of land it had captured from Israel, and the initial shock led to political upheaval. Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan faced severe criticism for failing to foresee the attack. And although a government inquiry blamed senior commanders, particularly Chief of Staff David Elazar, Meir ultimately resigned in April 1974. To the Arab world, however, the war was portrayed as a triumph that erased the humiliation of 1967. As President Hafez al-Assad declared, We have restored self-confidence to the Arab individual after healing his wounded dignity and proving to the world that our people are not an easy prey. Liqueur 144. Yet Egypt and Syria diverged after the war. Syria continued low-level fighting across the Golan Heights and executed captured Israeli soldiers, maintaining its war of attrition. Egypt instead honored the UN ceasefire and pursued diplomacy to regain the Sinai, angering Arab nations who accused Cairo of betraying pan-Arab unity and breaking the pledge of no negotiation with Israel. Egypt's political course shifted decisively westward. It reduced ties with the Soviet Union, reopened relations with the United States, and accepted American aid and technology. Israeli-U.S. relations also deepened, with Washington providing steady arms supplies. The war left the Palestinian question unresolved. During the fighting, Palestinian militants staged cross-border raids from southern Lebanon, though they achieved little militarily. Still, the continued presence of refugees and militant networks added pressure to already fragile Arab politics. Although an uneasy peace settled between Egypt and Israel, new conflict loomed on the horizon. In the decades since 1973, reports have surfaced suggesting Israel was prepared to use nuclear weapons if Arab forces had broken through during the Yom Kippur War. Such fears were not unique. Nuclear strategy dominated Cold War thinking. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union's dream of nuclear-powered progress lived on. Entire atom cities, or atomgrads, rose around new power plants, one of them near the Ukrainian town of Pripyat, home to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. If you want to learn more about the Soviet atomic program, from its wartime origins and the first nuclear bomb to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond, watch our 5-part documentary series Red Atoms. You can find it on Nebula, the streaming platform we built with fellow creators, where we can tell stories freely without worrying about ad restrictions or algorithms. Nebula streams in full 4K on your browser, phone, smart TV, or devices like Apple TV and Roku. Visit nebula.tv real-time history to get 40% off an annual subscription, just $36 a year, to watch Red Atoms and many other exclusive series. You can also choose a Nebula Lifetime membership, granting access to everything forever. 1/3 of that purchase directly supports our work at Real-Time History. Special thanks to Michael Adato for his assistance with this episode. To explore the Six-Day War of 1967, check out our documentary on that topic, or visit the Great War Channel to learn about the roots of the Middle East conflict in World War I, as always. Sources for this video are listed in the description. And if you're watching on Nebula or Patreon, thank you for your support. You make this work possible. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this has been a production of Real-Time History, the only history channel still brave enough to stand under a SAM umbrella.